You've heard the stories, echoing in mosques, woven into khutbahs, etched into children's books. The sea parting for Prophet Musa, the ark of Prophet Nuh rising above a flood of divine wrath, the fire that could not touch Prophet Ibrahim, and the voice that halted the blade before it fell. These are the stories that shaped our collective memory, passed down with reverence and awe. But the Quran is not a book of legends. It is a layered revelation, where even the quietest verse holds an ocean of meaning. Within it lie stories that many have never truly seen, verses overlooked, figures unnamed, shadows moving just beneath the surface. They are the forgotten corners of revelation, absent from the pulpit not because they lack power, but because they require stillness to hear. Some truths arrive not like trumpets but as whispers. They reveal themselves not through repetition, but reflection. They are the footnotes in the tafsir, the lines carried quietly by scholars across centuries. Some live in the margins of great works. Others hide in plain sight, in verses we recite but rarely pause to notice. They do not demand your attention, they wait for it. What does it mean that the Quran holds so many untold stories? That for every Musa, Isa, and Yusuf, there are countless others left unnamed? It is a reminder that divine truth is not measured by fame, but by faith. That some of the greatest acts of devotion were witnessed only by the one who matters. We expect power to be loud, to arrive with spectacle. Yet the Quran often exalts the opposite. Those who believe without seeing, those who bear their burdens in silence, those beloved by Allah though unknown to the world. Its stories leave room for lives like ours, quiet, overlooked, yet extraordinary in their sincerity. This is not a collection of forgotten trivia. It is a journey into the subtle veins of revelation, verses that shine not like lightning but like distant stars, visible only when the world grows still. The accounts you are about to hear are rooted in authentic tradition, drawn from the Quran and the words of scholars. They were never meant for the spotlight, not because they lack importance, but because they teach a quieter truth. Guidance is often a single moment, a small act, a prayer whispered in the dark. A man who believes but is never seen. A woman whose unrecorded prayer reaches the heavens. A place, a time, a fleeting witness to divine mercy. These stories are not just relics of the past. They are mirrors reflecting the version of ourselves that prays in secret, that walks in faith without applause, that Allah has never forgotten. So we begin not with spectacle, but with intention, to listen, to wonder, to uncover the stories that have always been there, waiting between the lines. It begins, as many stories do, in fear, not the fear that lashes out, but the fear that seeks shelter when the world grows too cruel. The story of the youths of the cave is beloved, told in sermons for centuries. They were young men of noble hearts, refusing to worship the false gods of their people. When threatened with punishment, they fled to a cave, entrusting their lives to Allah, and slept under His protection. Their courage is remembered, though their names are not. Most remember the miracle, their centuries of sleep, their preservation as a sign. Even the dog at the cave's entrance is mentioned, guarding them faithfully. Scholars debated, were they 7 or 8? Yet, in the margins of this story, there lingers a quieter figure. He never entered the cave. His name was never recorded, but some scholars speak of him with respect. He was older, perhaps a scribe, perhaps a healer who believed in their cause. He may have led them to the hidden cave, or stayed behind to mislead their pursuers. Some narrations suggest he was entrusted to preserve their story, leaving a record so their stand for Tawheed would not fade. One early account whispers that he prayed alone at the cave's edge, not for himself, but for them. He prayed their hearts remain firm, their sleep remain safe, their story remain remembered. Then he turned back toward the city, toward danger and disbelief. He would never be heard from again. It is easy to honor the youths who defied tyranny and became a living sign. But there is a quieter heroism in the man who stayed behind. He had no miracle to shield him, no cave to hide him. His faith lived and vanished in silence, unseen, uncelebrated, yet fully known to Allah. Why mention him at all if the Quran does not name him? Because faith is not always loud. Because some of the most powerful acts of belief happen where no one is looking. Because the Quran leaves space for those who carry the truth without recognition, who plant seeds of guidance they will never see grow. And so, our journey begins, in the quiet, where faith waits to be noticed. It was the cave that became a sign, but perhaps it was his silent prayer that set the story in motion. The early commentators sensed this. Even when they could not agree on his exact role, they spoke of him with a tenderness reserved for the forgotten. He was not a prophet nor a martyr in the formal sense, but he was something else. He was a reminder that true belief often requires letting go. That sometimes you help build something you will never live to see completed. That the prayer you whisper for someone else may echo longer than any plea for yourself. In an age where we long to be seen and credited, his story offers a counterweight. What if the truest faith is the one that does not demand an audience? What if the greatest honor is to be remembered only by God? When the sleepers awoke centuries later, the world had changed. The tyranny they once fled had crumbled. Faith had returned. Their message endured. And no one spoke of the man who never entered the cave. Yet perhaps, as they saw the sunlight cast across the cave mouth and the loyal dog still guarding its threshold, some trace of him stirred in their divinely shaped memory, a whisper of the one who had watched them disappear and faced the storm alone. We cannot trace his steps or mark his grave, but we can feel the weight of his choice. And in that weight is a story told not with thunder, but with silence, the kind of silence that only God records. Far from the cave, in the glittering halls of Pharaoh's court, another story of quiet faith unfolded. The palace shimmered with gold, every column and corridor saturated with power. Among its servants was a man whose name we will never know. He lived in silence, not by choice but by nature. His tongue had never formed a word. He had spent his life moving like a shadow through marble halls, carrying trays, sweeping floors, ignored by the powerful, invisible in a world where speech was strength. And yet, he listened. He watched. When Prophet Musa returned to the palace, no longer a fugitive but a messenger of the one God, the court was shaken. Laughter and ridicule filled the air, followed by fear and rage. Pharaoh summoned magicians. The tension rose. The air crackled with disbelief and arrogance. The Quran tells us of a believer among Pharaoh's own people who spoke cautiously in defense of Musa. But in the outer ring of the court stood another believer, the mute servant, whose faith could not be voiced. He had seen Musa before, perhaps as a child running through the palace gardens. He remembered the day the prince vanished, the whispers of blood and flight. And now the child had returned as a prophet, unarmed but unshaken. Something within the silent man stirred. He had spent a lifetime obeying Pharaoh, hiding thoughts behind blank eyes. But as he watched Musa stand firm, the servant found something deeper than fear. He found belief. His tongue could not speak it, his lips could not whisper it, but it burned in his chest. For the first time, his silence was not empty. It was full. His unspoken prayer rose where no human ear could hear. When the staff became a serpent and the magicians fell into sujud, the mute witness trembled. He had seen falsehood dressed in splendor all his life, but now he saw truth, barefoot on marble, unarmed yet invincible. Tears slipped down his face, not from terror, but from awe. Some early narrations suggest that after the confrontation, he scratched shapes into the wall behind his sleeping mat with a shard of pottery, the curve of a staff, the coils of a serpent, the bowed heads of the magicians. A silent testimony for himself alone. One night, an elderly kitchen worker noticed the change in his eyes. She whispered, "Did you see the prophet?" He nodded. "Do you believe?" He placed a hand over his heart and closed his eyes. She said, "I will pray that your tongue is loosened." But he shook his head. He no longer needed it. His voice had already reached the one who matters. History does not record his fate. He may have died in the palace, buried in silence. He may have escaped, walking among the believers unseen. We do not know. What we do know is this: Allah saw him. In a court where disbelief ruled, one man had no voice, and yet he was heard. His prayer was never spoken, but it was accepted. His testimony was never public, but it was recorded. Not every believer stands on a pulpit. Not every defender of truth is loud. Sometimes the greatest courage is to hold faith in utter stillness, to be a shadow in the eyes of the world but a witness in the sight of Allah. And now, the next story begins where most would expect an ending. In Surah Yasin, we are told of a town visited by 3 messengers. They came with no armies, only words, calling their people to return to their Creator, to abandon idols, to embrace truth. The town mocked them. They threatened the messengers, dismissed their warnings, and wore arrogance like armor. And in the midst of ridicule, there appeared one man. He was a humble figure, unknown, uncelebrated, who ran from the farthest end of the city to support the messengers. His voice was clear, his conviction firm. He pleaded with his people to see reason, to embrace mercy, to turn to the one who had created them. Their answer was violence. Some narrations say they killed him for his courage. Then the sky darkened, and the punishment fell swiftly. The entire town was flattened, its streets silent, its walls erased. That is where the verses of Surah Yasin leave the story. The surah moves on. The warning is delivered. But scholars who searched between the lines found another thread, a quieter one. There was another man in that town. He was neither among the mockers nor the bold defenders of the messengers. He was a silent believer, a laborer perhaps, or a farmer. His faith had never left his lips, but it weighed heavily on his heart. He had listened from the shadows. He had seen the scorn. He had watched the brave man run through the streets to speak truth and watched the crowd turn on him. When the air grew still and the sky began to shift, he felt what his people ignored, the tremor of judgment approaching. He did not flee. There was nowhere to run. The hills would not save him. The marketplace was already empty of life. In that moment of heavy silence, he turned inward. He walked to the center of his small home, faced the direction he thought was right, and lowered his forehead to the earth. It was the first sujud of his life, and what he believed would be the last. He did not ask to be spared. He did not ask for paradise. He asked only to be forgiven, for his silence, for his hesitation, for the courage he had never found. He prayed that if nothing else, his quiet belief would be enough. The punishment struck swiftly. The earth split. Winds and fire, forces beyond description, swept the town from existence. When the dust cleared, the city was gone, and in its ashes, one man still breathed. He did not understand why he had been spared, and he did not question it. He wandered the ruins, calling out, but no voice answered. He stayed. He buried what could be buried and prayed over what could not. He made his home in the silence left behind. Some say he lived there for years, a lone figure of repentance in a place that had rejected truth. Others say he left one day, carrying only a memory, a piece of cloth, and a single story. That belief, even whispered in the final hour, is never wasted. That a single moment of sincerity can split the sky. That silence is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the first step of return. The Qur'an does not name him. His story survives only in the margins of tafsir, in the hearts of those who ask what happens after the thunder fades. He was not the hero who ran through the streets. He was not the one who spoke before the crowd. But he turned toward Allah when it mattered most, and that was enough. The Qur'an does not need to name him, because his story is told in the pause between verses, in the breath between punishment and mercy. In that stillness, Allah's message lingers. It is easy to believe when others do. It is easy to be brave when the wind is at your back. But the faith that rises in the final hour, the sujud made in fear, in hope, in love, that is the faith that transforms silence into salvation. Far beyond that town, the Qur'an hints at even more forgotten lives. Prophets left unnamed, figures known only to Allah, people whose faith lived and died in obscurity. Surah Hud reminds us that every nation received a messenger, each carrying the same core message. Worship the one God, abandon falsehood, uphold justice. Among them was a prophet whose name has been lost to time. He came to a nomadic people who left no monuments, whose tents vanished with the shifting seasons, whose stories lived only in song and memory. He began not with sermons, but with questions. What do we owe the one who gave us breath? What power is there in a God who must be carried from place to place? What becomes of a people who trade mercy for fear? He spoke softly, and for a time they tolerated him. He was just a gentle voice around the fire, a wanderer who saw beyond the horizon. But in his quiet persistence, he planted seeds that would either take root or testify against them. He buried them beneath a flat stone behind his hut, knowing no one would understand. They were not words for the world. They were for the one who had shown him the sign. Majid's life continued as it had before. He gathered wood. He fetched water. He listened to the wind, to the villagers. He remained the strange man in the hills, silent and unreadable. But inside, his heart pulsed with a secret that needed no audience. Years passed. Travelers came and went, speaking of empires rising and falling, of new rulers and old feuds. Majid nodded politely, but his eyes always drifted back to the horizon at night. He never saw the sky split like that again. But he didn't need to. Once was enough. When Majid died, no one sang for him. No one wrote his name in stone. His hut collapsed into dust. His markings faded in the sand, and the symbols he buried remained hidden. But the record of his witness was never lost. It was written in the only place that mattered, in the knowledge of the one who had shown him the sign. Centuries later, when the Qur'an was revealed, its verses spoke of the Tariq, the piercing star, the visitor of the night sky, and of the heavens splitting as a sign. And though Majid was long gone, though his story survived in no book and no lineage, his heart had already whispered, "I saw it." He was a man forgotten by the world but not by God. His life was a quiet testimony that awe itself can be a form of worship, that some witnesses speak not with tongues but with hearts, that faith can live and die in silence and still be complete. These stories of the man who stayed outside the cave, the mute servant in Pharaoh's court, the silent believer of the doomed town, the nameless desert prophet, and Majid beneath the stars, are threads of a single truth. Faith is not always loud. Guidance is not always public. Some of the greatest stories in the Quran are the ones between the lines, lived in whispers, in footsteps, in prayers that never reached human ears but soared directly to the heavens. They remind us that Allah sees the unseen, that belief without recognition is still belief, and that sometimes the smallest, quietest act of faith can echo longer than a lifetime. Majid buried his markings beneath a flat stone behind his hut, and then he waited, not for the sky to split again, but for someone else to come, someone who would speak aloud the truth he had only glimpsed. Years passed. Majid died quietly, wrapped in his cloak, his face turned toward the stars he had spent his life studying. His hut crumbled to dust. The wind carried away the last traces of his steps. But his story did not end there. Many years later, the Prophet Muhammad recited the words, "By the sky and the night visitor. And what will make you know what the night visitor is? It is the piercing star." Surah at-Tariq 86:1-3. Hearts trembled at the sound. Among the elders, an old tale resurfaced, passed from one traveler to another, of a man who had once claimed to see the heavens open, of strange markings found near the ruins of a lonely hut, of a Tariq that left the night sky torn. They carried the story to the scholars, and the scholars could not confirm it. But the echo of the verse gave the story a weight beyond proof. It was as if the man who watched the stars had spent his life waiting for a voice he would never hear, a message that would arrive long after he was gone. Perhaps that was his role, not to speak, not to lead, but to witness. In the silence of the desert, one man saw a sign. He told no one. He asked for nothing. But his awe became part of something eternal. The Quran is filled with signs for those who reflect. Some are heard by multitudes. Others are seen by a single heart in the quiet of night. Both are written in the same sky. Most of us know the loud stories, the ones told in every khutbah and children's book. The prophets who split seas, the messengers who faced tyrants, the cities that were warned and then destroyed. They are mighty, and they are meant to be remembered. But scattered between those familiar verses are quieter stories, ones without names, without locations, without monuments or miracles to impress the world. Yet they are no less sacred. A mute servant in Pharaoh's palace who could not speak, but believed. A man who fell to the ground in sujud moments before punishment, and found mercy in his final breath. A lone watcher of the night sky, who saw a truth he would never live to declare. They are not heroes in the way history likes to remember heroes. No statues, no parades, no one called their names. But in their stillness, they moved something eternal. In a world where being seen often feels more important than being sincere, these stories are a mercy. They remind us that Allah does not need our faith to be loud. He needs it to be true. They tell us that a moment of return, even if it comes late, is still a moment that can change everything. That a whispered prayer is heard, that a silent witness is counted, and that a life lived in the shadows can still be flooded with light in the sight of Allah. These are stories for the people who feel small, for those who pray behind closed doors, who believe in silence, who stumble and get up and try again. The Quran is not a book of legends. It is a guide for every soul, the bold and the quiet, the ones who call from mountaintops and the ones who kneel in dust. And it whispers through every hidden story the same timeless truth. You do not need to be great to be loved by God. You only need to be sincere. The world may never know your name, but in the heavens you are already known.